America's role in the world has been the subject of heated debate for a long, long time. Today, some people assert that the US is still the world's sole superpower. Others argue that there are additional major powers at play. Perhaps America has already been or will shortly be supplanted by China. Beyond this debate, there's an even greater question of how the US's standing will actually change in coming years. There's a sense that change is afoot. Case in point, there was a recent YouGov poll of American citizens showing that 50% believe that the US was at least somewhat likely to lose superpower status in the next 10 years. So how did we get here? What factors helped bring the US to its current place? And where exactly does it stand? So good evening again, everyone. I'm Mary Eintema, president of World Boston, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Chat and Chowder program. A few reminders before we get started. As I hope you know, the mission of World Boston is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. Whether they are virtual, back in person, or hybrid, our programs will probably always change, but this mission persists. So thank you very much for being here and being part of our mission. Please do learn more about World Boston at worldboston.org. And if you can, please do support our work financially. We can't do it without you. Now, housekeeping. Tonight, when we turn to audience Q&A, use the raise your hand function. When you're called on, we'll bring you up as a panelist to ask your questions. So turn on your camera before that and stay muted until it's your turn. We hope that tonight you'll stay with us following the program for the post-chat chat. Tonight's community discussion will be facilitated by Hendrik Unasorga, who is an associate at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center. And everyone is welcome to join along with your enjoyable beverages. And we will also raffle off 3 copies of the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy during the post-chat chat. You have to be there to win, so please join in. And now, at last, it is really such a great pleasure for me to introduce tonight's speaker and my former professor, Michael Mandelbaum. He is the Kristen A. Herter Professor Emeritus of American Foreign Policy at the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies, aka SAIS. He has held teaching posts at Harvard and Columbia and at the U.S. Naval Academy. He serves on the board of advisors of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and is a graduate of Yale College. He earned his master's at King's College, Cambridge University, and his doctorate at the other Cambridge at Harvard. He's the author of 16 previous books, including Mission Failure, The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth, and with Thomas Friedman, That Used to Be Us. Professor Mandelbaum, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mary, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. My book, The 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy, covers 250 years between 1765 and 2015. And it has 3 purposes. The first of them is simply to tell the story of American foreign policy over those 2.5 centuries, touching on, describing, and explaining the most important developments and the major personalities involved in American foreign policy. The second purpose of the book is to engage with the principal controversies involving these 2.5 centuries of American foreign policy. So in the book, I address such questions as, why did the 13 colonies rebel against the British Empire? Why was there a Cold War, and why did it end as it did? Which American presidents were successful and which were unsuccessful in conducting American foreign policy? Spoiler alert, Thomas Jefferson does not come out well in this book. The third purpose of the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy is to draw out the themes that run throughout the course of the history of America's relations with the rest of the world. What are those themes? Well, the history of American foreign policy, like the history of everything, exhibits both continuities and changes. And the book is rests on both the principal continuities and the major changes over 250 years. I'll take each of them in turn. First, the continuities. In its history, American foreign policy has been, in comparison with the foreign policies of other countries, unusually ideological, unusually economic, and unusually democratic. What do I mean by that? Well, by unusually ideological, I mean that more than almost any other country, the United States has sought to spread its domestic political values to other countries, the two most important being democracy within countries and peace among them. Now, the United States is not the only country ever to attempt to spread these values. The effort to do so was a major theme in the foreign policy of Great Britain in the 19th century, and it has been important in the foreign policies of the countries of Western Europe since 1945. Nor is it the case that the United States has devoted itself in its foreign policy exclusively to trying to promote its values beyond its borders. In fact, in its history, the United States has had two principal approaches to foreign policy. The first of these is sometimes called realism. It centers on considerations of power. It aims at defending national interests, and its goal in the world is a stable balance of power. There was an early 20th century American president who was identified with realism, and he was Theodore Roosevelt, the first President Roosevelt, who spent a fair amount of his presidency trying to contrive a stable power balance in East Asia. The second principal approach to foreign policy by the United States historically is, as I've mentioned, the promotion of American values. And that is also identified with an early 20th century president, and that president is Woodrow Wilson. Although this approach does stem from the beginning of the Republic, it is so closely identified with President Wilson that it's been given the name Wilsonianism. Wilson, after World War I, sought to establish not a stable balance of power, but rather a global community of power, working through the international organization that he helped to found, the League of Nations, that he did not succeed in persuading the United States to join. Now, for the United States, as for most countries throughout most of history, the realist approach has been dominant. When the United States faced a choice between protecting its interests or promoting its values, it has almost always opted for the protection of interests. But values have always been important. The promotion of democracy and peace has always mattered in the United States, especially since the beginning of the 20th century. It's always been an item on the foreign policy agenda. It's always been taken into consideration, and its relative importance is one of the things that makes American foreign policy distinctively American. By a relatively economic foreign policy, I mean that historically the United States has attempted to use economic levers, economic instruments, to promote political goals abroad. And this goes all the way back to the period before the founding of the American Republic. It goes back to the Revolutionary War. We all remember that one of the causes of that war was the 13 colonies' unhappiness with taxes that the British Parliament was trying to impose on them, taxes that the Americans regarded as unjust. An initial response to those taxes was to boycott British goods, to put pressure on the British merchants who imported them, to try to get those merchants, in turn, to put pressure on the British Parliament to rescind them. And that effort enjoyed a modicum of success, at least early on. So economic boycotts, economic sanctions go back all the way to the latter part of the 18th century. There's certainly nothing new in American foreign policy. Between the 18th and the 20th centuries, the major economic instrument the United States tried to deploy to achieve political goals was trade. But at the beginning of the 20th century, in the administration of William Howard Taft, in a program known as dollar diplomacy, the United States attempted to employ the export of capital for foreign policy purposes. And that has continued into the 21st century. What do I mean by an unusually democratic foreign policy? What I mean is that compared with other countries, the public has had unusually broad influence in the formulation and implementation of American foreign policy. In Europe, traditionally, when the European powers were the great powers of the world in particular, foreign policy was the preserve of the monarch and the aristocracy. But the United States had neither, and that left space for an unusual degree of public influence on foreign policy, especially through public opinion. Public opinion and this democratic aspect of American foreign policy in general have both helped to start American wars and helped to end them. There is a recurrent pattern in the history of American foreign policy in which a dramatic event takes place, usually abroad, but occasionally in the United States. It makes the world seem suddenly more dangerous to Americans. It galvanizes the American public and leads to a demand for a more robust foreign policy in dealing with the newly perceived danger that has sometimes led to warfare. So, for example, in 1898, the sinking of the American battleship Maine in Havana Harbor created a climate of opinion that permitted the Spanish-American War. Less than 2 decades later, in 1915, during World War I, in which the United States was resolved to stay out, the German sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania completely changed the American public's perception of Germany and its role in the war, and that paved the way for the American entry into that war 2 years later in 1917 against Germany. In December 1941, on December 7th to be precise, the Japanese attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, led to the United States formally entering World War II. And of course, we all remember the terrorist attacks on Washington and New York of September 11, 2001, which led to 2 American wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But public opinion has helped to bring American wars, or at least American participation in wars, to an end. In the American war in Vietnam, actually also to an extent in Korea, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq, public opinion turned against American participation. And American public opinion ultimately compelled the American government either to bring the war to a close, as in Korea, or to withdraw American participation in it, as in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Now, it's important to note that in none of those cases did the public turn against the goals that the United States was seeking in the war. Rather, while continuing to endorse in principle those goals, Americans decided that the cost of pursuing them was too high, and therefore that the United States should not continue to do so. And the cost was measured not in dollars, but in American casualties, in blood and in American deaths in particular. It's also worth noting here that every American war, without exception, has given rise to dissent. That was true from the very beginning, although dissent has taken different forms for different American wars. In the Revolutionary War, for example, those who opposed the American military effort to secede from the British Empire simply moved north to Canada, which of course remained a part of that empire. To take another example, in World War II, the most intense opposition to formal American participation in that conflict came before the United States formally entered it in December 1941. It took the form in part of membership in a movement called America First. But after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, America First declined sharply, and active opposition to the war more or less melted away. It's also worth noting that the public, the democratic dimension of American foreign policy has made the United States a difficult country to predict, at least for American adversaries, and that has led to miscalculation. So, for example, the Japanese government did not expect the ferocity of the American response to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Similarly, Saddam Hussein did not expect, when he invaded Kuwait in August 1990, that the United States would not only organize a global coalition to oppose his annexation of that country, but would actually send 450,000 American troops to the Persian Gulf region and evict his army from Kuwait. Well, those are the continuities. What about the changes? The single most important change in American foreign policy over 250 years has been the steady growth in American power relative to other countries. And power is, of course, relative in the international system. The growth in American power has given the United States 4 successive different roles in international politics, and those roles are reflected in the subtitle of the book. From 1765 to 1865, the United States was a weak power, concerned mainly to defend its own independence so that it could get on with its major project of expanding across North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific. From 1865 to 1945, the United States was a great power, and it engaged in the 2 kinds of international conduct in which great powers customarily engage. It both cooperated but also competed with other great powers, and it carved out a sphere of influence for itself, in the American case in Central America and in the Eastern Pacific. During this period, it should be noted, the United States became a formal empire with the acquisition of the Philippines as a result of the Spanish-American War. But compared with the great empires, especially the great overseas empires of the European great powers, the American empire came late, was very modest, and was really half-hearted. It played almost no role in the life of the nation, and Americans generally didn't pay any attention to it. Well, from 1945 to 1990, the United States was a superpower engaged in political, military, and economic conflict with the rivals superpower, the Soviet Union, all around the world. And from 1990 to 2015, the United States acted as the world's only hyperpower. The term comes from the French foreign minister, Hubert Védrine, who called the United States in this period an hyperpuissance. How did the United States get so powerful? Well, it steadily amassed over time the ingredients of power in the international order. It increased its size, its population, and its economic output. In particular, the United States became and has remained powerful because of its mastery of the techniques of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, of course, began in Great Britain at the end of the 18th century, but by the end of the 19th, the United States not only had the largest economy in the world, but had put itself at the cutting edge of the Industrial Revolution, was leading the world in innovation, and has remained there more or less ever since. And that has proven to be, over the last century and more, the key to power in international relations. Well, let me now say a few things about the United States and war. America has engaged in a number of wars, 12 major conflicts by my reckoning, and numerous lesser skirmishes over this century and a half. War provided the transition from one American role to the next. Winning the Revolutionary War made the United States an independent country and enabled it to conduct an independent foreign policy. The outcome of the Civil War paved the way for the United States to emerge as a great power in the second half of the 19th century. American participation in the victorious coalition in World War II made it one of the world's two superpowers, and America leading the winning coalition in the Cold War left it as the world's sole hyperpower. A couple of other comments about the United States and war. Although war has been a not infrequent activity of the United States, I don't think it's right to call America a warlike country. For all of its major wars, Americans saw themselves as acting on a defensive basis. And in almost all of them, it had a reasonable case for taking this position, although other countries, of course, did not always see things that way. The one clear exception to this pattern was the Mexican War of 1846 to 1848. That was a war of territorial conquest, as a result of which large parts of what are now the American Southwest and the American West came into the Union. Another notable feature of America's experience with war is that in each of the three major wars that the United States fought, it was fortunate to have an excellent commander-in-chief. In the Revolutionary War, George Washington turned out to be a good battlefield commander, and his success in command on the battlefield largely consisted of avoiding battles with the superior British forces. But Washington also served as a symbol of the new country, around which not only the troops of the Continental Army, but also the people in general of the 13 colonies were able to rally and did rally. In the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln understood what was required for victory, namely destroying the army of the Confederacy. He found a general, Ulysses S. Grant, who was able to carry out that strategy. And Lincoln persisted in the war until victory was won, despite a very heavy cost and real dissatisfaction and discontent on the Union side. In World War II, Franklin Roosevelt had to make a number of difficult strategic decisions that were controversial at the time and have been controversial ever since, but in retrospect seem, or at least I so argue in the 4 Ages of American Foreign Policy, to have been the right decisions. Between the fall of France in May of 1940 and formal American entry into World War II in December of 1941, Roosevelt sent as much assistance as he could to Great Britain to enable the British to persist in holding out against Nazi Germany. And in the middle of that period, on June 22nd, 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, Roosevelt also sent aid to the Soviets, despite the reservation of his generals who thought that the supplies would be wasted because the Soviet Union would be quickly conquered. And despite the objections from some quarters of America against giving aid to a government that was relentlessly and viciously anti-religious. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, Roosevelt chose what came to be called a Europe First strategy. He put the emphasis of the American effort and sent the bulk of American resources to the European theater rather than to Asia, even though the attack that prompted the American declaration of war had come from Asia, from Japan. And finally, he chose the middle of 1944 for the crucial cross-channel invasion of France by American, British, and Canadian forces. And it took place on June 6, 1944, known then and ever after as D-Day. And he chose that period despite the objections of one of his principal allies, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, who wanted that invasion to come much earlier, and despite the objection, or at least reservation, of his other principal ally, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, who wanted to postpone it, perhaps indefinitely. Final note about these 3 commanders-in-chief: each of them was very good at what is the most important job for any American commander-in-chief during wartime, and is sometimes the most difficult one, namely keeping the American public committed to fighting. Well, now a closing word about the recent past and the present and future. The first 3 eras, the first 3 ages of American foreign policy were ones in which the United States enjoyed clear success. As a weak power, the United States defended its independence. As a great power, it was on the winning side in the 2 world wars of the first half of the 20th century. And as a superpower, it led the coalition that won the Cold War. But the 4th age of American foreign policy, the age of the American hyperpower, was different. There, the United States did not enjoy comparable success. Why not? Well, the American government did make mistakes of policy that I discuss in the 4th part of the 4 ages of American foreign policy. One of them was to expand the North Atlantic Treaty Organization eastward toward Russia and ultimately to Russia's borders, despite the fact that American and European officials had promised Russian and Soviet officials that this would not happen, and despite unanimous Russian objections to this measure. And this took place, recall, during the first part of the 1990s, where Russia had a democratically inclined leader, President Boris Yeltsin, who wanted to join rather than fight the West, very different from the current Russian president. But the main reason for American failure in the fourth age of American foreign policy, in my view, was the major project that the United States undertook in those 25 years. The United States tried to encourage, foster, and in a few cases, actually implant a particular kind of government, our kind of government. The United States sought to bring about in different countries by different methods around the world, a country that practiced democracy, respected human rights, a government that fostered prosperity, and a government that was at peace with its neighbors. And it did this, as I say, in a number of countries around the world. Now, there's nothing wrong with this goal. It's a laudable one. But the problem was that the United States didn't and probably could not have succeeded. The reason for that is that this type of government has preconditions, prerequisites. It requires a certain set of institutions. It requires a certain set of values. It requires a certain set of experiences, and none of these can be acquired overnight. It takes at least a generation to endow a particular country with any of them. Moreover, none of them can be transplanted from abroad. They have to arise indigenously, all of which means that America's major project during the fourth era of American foreign policy deserves the title of Mission Impossible. Well, what of the present and the future? We're now in the fifth era of American foreign policy, as yet unnamed, or at least not named by me. And we don't know what its contours will turn out to look like. It's still too soon to know. But we can say one thing with confidence about the future of the fifth era of American foreign policy. We can say confidently that it will be composed of three things, that it will be determined by three forces. First, the continuing American predilection to conduct a foreign policy that is unusually ideological, unusually economic, and unusually democratic. Second, America's relative power in the world compared with other countries. And third and last, but certainly not least, the fifth age of American foreign policy will be determined by the unpredictable contingencies of human history. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Mandelbaum. I'm going to enjoy very much the privilege of being moderator and asking a question. I actually have many, but one, we were talking about this a little bit before, but why we all felt that 9/11 was a game changer, was a complete break with so many things, and many people look at an era ending at that time, but you pick 2015, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that decision a little bit. How did our status as a hyperpower change then?
Sure, it's a very good question. Before I answer it, let me say that I write a monthly essay on foreign affairs and other issues, and I send it out free of charge to a distribution list And anybody who is taking part in this Zoom session who wishes to be placed on the distribution list can do so by sending your email to me at the following email address: American Foreign Policy, all one word, at jhu.edu. That's American Foreign Policy, all one word, at jhu.edu, and I will be glad to send you my monthly essay free of charge. Now, Mary, as to your question, why 2015? Well, first you have to start somewhere. You have to stop somewhere. You have to start somewhere too. Second, 1765 and the Stamp Act to 2015 makes for a nice round number of 250 years. But third, and most importantly, I argue that the fourth era, the fourth age of American foreign policy, was distinguished by the absence of serious security threats and major security challenges to the United States. By 2015, it was clear that that was no longer the case. It was clear that China was mounting a challenge that was not just political, but military. It was clear that Russia was challenging the European security order with its invasion, its first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And given my view of the Iran deal of 2015, it was clear to me that Iran was going to mount, or was already mounting, a security challenge. So the defining feature of the fourth era of American foreign policy had, by 2015, disappeared. And I should add, for those of you who are interested, the last book that I published, called The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth, charts the rise of these challenges, of these three challenges from Russia, China, and Iran, and gives my explanation for why they happen.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we'll go to Raul. Hi, Raul, go right ahead.
Oh, thank you very much for a magnificent overview. Professor, I'm curious your ideas on the American dependence or interdependence, independence, dependence, interdependence in world affairs. Most of its engagements abroad have involved a large number of perhaps like-minded, or at least equally important stakeholders in the activity, from our American Revolution to our most recent engagements. But looking ahead, in contrast to this last period that you outlined, where we were relatively able to act alone, or at least were the principal actors, looking ahead, do you believe we'll be more dependent on others? In other words, that interdependence in foreign affairs will be a more remarkable feature of American foreign policy?
Good question. I would distinguish between dependence and engagement. The United States is probably less dependent on other countries than most other countries in the world. The American economy depends less on trade and foreign investment than most other countries. And America can certainly defend itself without the help of other countries. In fact, it's the United States that helps other countries defend themselves. So I don't see economic or political dependence rising substantially, in the sense that I don't see the United States needing other countries either to maintain a decent standard of living or to protect itself. The great question, in my view, is whether the United States will remain engaged, whether it will remain the pillar of the Western created and Western dominated global economic order, and whether the United States will maintain its formal and informal alliances on which many countries depend for their security. Those two commitments, the American global role in the world, grew out of World War II, but it was born really by the Cold War, when Americans remembering the past war and remembering that they thought that they could stay out of it and then failed to do so, decided that their security depended on having an open global economic order and depended on the United States being a European and an East Asian power. When the Cold War ended at the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s, the original impetus for American engagement disappeared, but the American role persisted for a variety of reasons, one of which was inertia, another of which was it didn't cost much. It was no strain to police the world in the way that we did and to take part in the global economic order. In fact, globalization was economically of benefit to Americans. So now that the world is more dangerous, the question is, will we sustain that role? And I think it's noteworthy that the last two presidents have sought, at least partly, to pull back American engagement. Obama in the Middle East, Trump in Europe. So when you have two presidents of such differing political persuasions lining up behind one broad trend, you have to take it seriously. Will this trend continue? Will the American role in the world shrink? I don't know. And I don't think I'll be around to write about it when we know for sure.
Okay, thank you. I want to, before I go to the next question, I want to remind people that we do have our community hangout, I guess, coming up after this. And we are raffling off books, and you have to be there to get a book. Plus it's fun. Please do join in on that. So look at all the things you get. You get a free essay once a month, you get a book, such a deal. Anyway, we are going to go now to Jalal. Jalal, go right ahead and turn on your camera, please.
Hi, I'm joining from Bahrain and the Far East, and now it's almost 2 o'clock post midnight. This is my second session to attend Professor Mandelbaum with his latest book. I have 2 or 3 questions. The first one,
well, let's try one first, and then we'll see how we do for time. Okay.
Okay, then I will go to the most important one. I know that the war and the wars that America took determined most of its 4 ages, but I'm questioning how did, or intentionally or not intentionally, did the US presidents over these 4 ages contributed to reaching to these ages? Particularly, I'm a little bit concerned about the Arab Spring, which is a recent thing that I have witnessed, and I have been very much following it and what was the dynamics during it and post it. So was there any noticed significant US president contribution to forming the foreign policy of America, and accordingly the one or more than one of the 4 ages?
Well, thank you, and thank you for staying up so late. American presidents were always important in American foreign policy. They operated within a framework that I've described, within the framework of relative American power. After all, if the United States were the size of Belgium, it would not be a factor in the Middle East. And it operated within the framework of the continuities that I have noted. What I think is perhaps interesting about American foreign policy is that presidents have not been all powerful. In other countries, the leader generally has more relative power than the American president does. And of course, that's a function of our constitutional system. The people who designed the Constitution did not want to concentrate power in one place, and so they didn't. And so the Congress and the public and the great departments of the federal government all have influence over foreign policy. I hope that's helpful.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, and Jalal, we're honored by your staying up so late and joining us. All right, so now we are going to go to Tom Smith.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Appreciate your broad overview. I mentioned that I'm a former assistant professor of international relations at West Point, and I commend your efforts at the Naval Academy. My question is regarding the international system that you touched on somewhat, that was formulated after World War II, the political, economic, and military institutions that most would argue have served us pretty well. But of course have shown some signs of age over the decades since then, and many would argue that were undermined to some degree under President Trump's administration. So my question is, what do you see about those institutions, and whether there is a prospect for real reform, or where should we go in terms of that international system?
Well, those are good questions, and that is a major issue facing the United States going forward. I think in the economic system, we've certainly made an effort to include China, which is the most important new force in the international economic order. And to the extent that the Chinese are not participating or are not being good citizens of the order, I think that's on them. And I think it has to do with the nature of their political system. In the political and security order, unfortunately, the three disturbers of the peace, Russia, China, and Iran, do not accept it. And that too, I think, has to do in no small part with their domestic political systems. I go into this at some length in my previous book, The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth, also published by Oxford. But I also believe that we made a mistake in the early 1990s in not doing more to include the Russians in the Euro-Atlantic order. That's why I think, and I wrote at some length, and I write again in this book, that expanding NATO while making it clear that Russia would never be invited to join in the early 1990s, when Russia was a struggling democracy, was a mistake.
Why don't we jump over to Hendrik, and then we'll come back to Mark. Hendrik, go right ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, and thank you very much, Professor Mandelbaum. I greatly enjoyed your talk and reading the book as much as I did enjoy reading your previous ones. I'm a big subscriber to the idea that power is very important in international affairs, working in international affairs as well. You mentioned a lot, and this is my question, you talked a lot about military and economic power, but I'm specifically interested in other forms of power as well. Do you see any importance, or do you attribute any importance to what is called American soft power in these 4 ages, and where does it stand today, perhaps heading into a 5th age? Thank you very much.
Well, I think that what is sometimes called soft power is important, and I think that the American example has been important, especially in the 20th century, probably more in economic terms than in political terms. After all, the United States was the first mass consumption society, and now every society on the planet aspires to that. It's also true that the United States was a democracy and served in a sense as a beacon of democracy, but there are lots of other democracies as well. In the Eastern European transition to democracy, I think Western Europe was probably more important than the United States. I do have one difference with the idea of soft power, and that is, although I think it is what is called soft power is extremely important, it's culture, it's example. The historian William McNeill says that change comes about through contact between and among people of different cultures. But I don't think it's truly power, because I don't think it can be wielded. I don't think we can use our culture to get another country to do something we want it to do. Sometimes they reorganize their societies in ways that we like because of our example and other countries' examples. But I take power to be something that a government can wield and use. And it seems to me that soft power, for all of its undoubted importance, doesn't fit into that category.
Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. All right, we'll go, how are we for time? Okay, we'll go to Joel, please.
Okay, so my question is, you mentioned the importance of democracy in American foreign policy. Another phrase is that in American foreign policy, politics ends at the shore, at the nation's shore. To what extent has partisanship been a factor in U.S. foreign policy, and is it likely to become more so in the future?
I think it's been a factor from the beginning. We overrate the force of bipartisanship in American foreign policy because that was important during the Cold War and World War II, and especially the first part of the Cold War. The Mexican War, for example, was opposed by the Whigs. The Civil War was obviously divisive in a much deeper way. The Federalists opposed the War of 1812. So I think we sometimes idealize the phrase politics stops at the water's edge. That's why I said that every American war without exception has given rise to dissent. Now, I think it's also true that in recent years, wars have become more partisan. Since the end of from the end of World War II to the Second Gulf War, we didn't have wars where one party favored it and the other party was opposed. But in the Second Gulf War, most Democrats, not all Democrats, but most Democrats were opposed. But in the Vietnam War, you'll recall that this was started by a Democratic administration by President Kennedy, continued by President Johnson, and then continued by President Nixon. I think Mr. Schneider, who got cut off, may have been asking whether the United States will be able to fight more foreign wars given our decreased sensitivity to casualties and our rising national debt. Let me say two things about that. I do think that sensitivity to casualties will limit direct American participation in foreign wars. Our sensitivity to casualties is less now than it was during the Cold War because the Vietnam and Korean wars were seen in effect as part of the Cold War, and the country was committed to that. I think the tolerance for casualties is now lower, so that in the first Gulf War, when we took almost no casualties, if we'd started to take casualties, I think, and there are some political scientists who've done research, such as John Mueller of Ohio State, who agree with this, support for the war could have fallen off rapidly. As for the impact of the national debt, I published a book about 15 years ago called The Frugal Superpower, in which I argued that the rising annual deficits and the mounting debt would inhibit America's capacity to conduct the kind of foreign policy it wants to do. I've been waiting for 15 years to see some evidence of this. So far, I haven't. There must be a point at which our debt will have an impact on policies such as foreign policy. I thought it would come 10 years ago. So far, it hasn't. So while I agree with what I interpret to be the question that was implicit in that, and although I'm on record as agreeing with that, so far events have proved me wrong.
Okay, thank you. All right, we're going to close out with a lightning question from Jack. Jack, go right ahead.
Professor, thank you. I'm just curious if in your reference to human nature and culture being more determinative of the fifth era, whether or not you believe that a constructivist approach is increasingly necessary to understand where American foreign policy is heading.
Could you tell us what you mean by a constructivist approach?
Yes, relying more so on a cultural and intercultural approach to measuring how different nations will interact, and relying less on a realist or liberalist internationalist approach.
Well, my understanding of constructivism, and it's a little bit different from yours, you're probably better acquainted with it than I am, is that it places great emphasis on international organizations. I think international organizations are important. They've done good work. But I think culture is important. I think international organizations are effective to the extent that countries are democratic. But they can't do everything, and they don't work without a substructure of power. I think that the ensemble of international organizations that have come into being, and some of which have been very effective since World War II, rest on the basis of American power. So I'm afraid that until the whole world becomes democratic, and I don't expect to see that anytime soon, the world of international organizations, of international cooperation, what I think of at least as the constructivist world, is going to depend ultimately on American power.
Okay, thank you. I fear that we are coming up on our deadline. I do want to remind everyone that many of us are going over to another link to talk about great powers and great ideas and other great things, whatever they may be. So hope to see you there. I want to see the audience, all of us and all of your friends next week at the Boston Public Library for a discussion of space and foreign policy, a very important topic. But before that, what a great pleasure, Professor Mandelbaum, to have you with us. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a particular pleasure to see a very successful former student in Mary. And I remind you that if you want to be on the mailing list, the email list to get my monthly essay, give me your email address at American Foreign Policy, that's all one word, @jhu.edu. Thank you.
And you don't even have to write a paper after you read it. So anyway, thank you all very much. Have a good night.
Thank you.